Good morning. Before we start our class, Ken's going to lead us in a quick word of prayer. Thank you. Thank you. We are going to conclude our study on James, the brother of Jesus, this week. Next week, I think it'll only be a one week study, but I need to do a little bit more work, and I'll send that out to Sue, and it'll be sent to you all what the topic is going to be. Got two things I'm working on, so haven't decided yet. This week we're just going to go through very quickly the themes of James's writings, the book of James. It is, if not the earliest New Testament writing, then the second. You can read for yourselves in the commentaries whether 1 Thessalonians or James was written first. Both of them were written around 48 to 50 AD. So it's by far one of the earliest writings in the New Testament. It is a extremely practical book. It is not theological in any way. James was writing to Jews about how to be a Christian. And since I teach the high school kids a lot, every time I kind of have had a couple of years and I've basically got a new crop of high school kids, we always start with James. If you're trying to talk to teenagers about how to live a Christian life, the easiest book to work with them on is James, without a doubt. It's easy to apply to their lives. It's easy to apply to what they're going through. It's something that they can talk about in a way of how that particular saying that James has presented applies to their lives at school, how it applies to their life at home. It applies to their life here amongst other Christians. Now, each of you, looking around here, I know all of your children. I have taught them. So I'm looking around this audience. I have taught all of your children. And each of them is different in a very peculiar way. But the one verse that I ask your kids to quote every Sunday morning when we're studying James is James 1:22. And we do it over and over again. And it goes a long way towards getting them to understand that if you want to be a successful Christian, don't talk so much. People get tired of hearing about you. And it has a broad application not only to being a Christian, but it has broad application to them being successful in serving God. So we go through pretty much all of what they're experiencing in school, be it they in school or they're homeschooled, or how they interact with their brothers and sisters and their parents in particular. And I just always ask them, do you find talking when you're being given commands or given direction to be helpful? And all of them will, but they don't understand. That's the first thing they'll say about you as parents. They don't understand. And I said, okay, well, let's go through it. And once again, some of them will offer up their personal experiences. Some of them won't. But I said, all right, so give me an example. And you will probably be able to identify your child from this. Well, Mom didn't understand why what happened. I said, really? They go, yeah. I said, so your mom was telling you to do X? Correct. You didn't want to do X? Correct. I got to jump to the end here. did your talking change anything about what your mom was telling you to do? No. I started laughing. I said, so the more words you said made things better or worse? And to one of the teenagers' credit, she goes, now that you mention it, it just got worse. It got worse the more I talked. I said, is there a lesson here for all of us? And one of your children said, no, my mom just needs to get smarter. I said, well, I'll come back to you in a year and see how that's working out for you. So I actually followed up with that child and said, Mom getting any smarter? She goes, no, but my approach is changing. I started laughing. I said, well, as you get older, your folly of Mom wasn't all that far off. But how about the other things we talked about in James? And the thing that we really focus on is, if you want to be viewed as a servant and Christ-like, even when you are talking, you're better off asking questions about the person you're participating in the conversation with. Try and understand their perspective. Try and understand why they're taking the position they're taking. Try and understand where they are on their journey. And if you take a servant's focus, which is what James is asking you to do here, it's really hard to be a servant if you don't understand the perspective of the person you're trying to serve. And it'll not only do you, there's not a position in society where if you better understand the people you're interacting with, you can't be a better Christian. And that's kind of the theme of James. James goes through it. Some people refer to James as the Proverbs of the New Testament because it just has a bunch of applications. James doesn't spend a lot of time on the cross. He doesn't spend a lot of time on Christ's life. James focuses on, here's what you need to do to be Christ-like. So we're just going to go through some of the key scriptures. So first we're going to start off with James chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of any kind, because you know the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its works so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. So it's interesting the way James starts his book. Here's a truism. If you're going to be a Christian living in the world around about you, you're going to have to persevere. The world around about you that you're dealing with at school, at work, isn't Christian. You are going to run into conflict constantly. And what James is saying, keep the principles, work the faith. You'll be rewarded for it. And that's kind of, as you can imagine, if you talk to the teenagers, there's easy conversations to be had there. They'll run with that. If you ask them how this is affecting you and how do you react to that. The next one is James chapter 1, following verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Also, if you go over to James chapter 3 and verse 17. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, peacemakers who sow peace and raise a harvest of righteousness. So when you bring those two things together, you find a God who will give you wisdom. But James goes a step further, and he says you'll know whether or not you've received wisdom because you'll have the following attributes. And it kind of adds to that practical advice from James of be slow to talk and quick to listen. And yeah, I still do a ton of consulting with management, people who have run across in life. And it's always good when you start to share things that people taught you because they were valuable in your experience. And the one thing that the gentleman who took me under his wing when I left audit to become a consultant, he told me one time, he said, "You're not prepared to be a consultant." I started laughing, going, "Good advice." Now where do we go from here? He started laughing. He goes, "Has anyone ever described your style to you before?" I said, "Constantly, but let's hear what you got." He goes, "You're given a problem," and he said, "it's like a whirlwind." He said, "Things are just flying and things are coming out of the hole and you're digging and you got people doing a lot of stuff," but he said, "Is there a strategy?" I started laughing. I said, "As you said, I'm not the greatest consultant. I've been kind of given a problem and I've been told to work it. So we're working it. Knowledge comes as we work it, and then we'll develop a strategy." He goes, "That's not how they teach it at Harvard." I started laughing. I go, "Didn't make it to Harvard." And he started to laugh and he said, "Look, the one thing I will tell you that will bear fruit for you, and it's something that, I think the two attributes that will make you successful." And he said, one, you understand that in order to lead, you have to be in the fray. He said, so I'll give you points there. And number two, he said, and I don't know if this was your parents or it's your Christian upbringing, but he said, the one thing I got to be honest, Jeff, that will make you extremely successful is you listen. He said, you don't feel it necessary to talk. He said, I don't know how many people in my consulting career sabotage themselves because they feel the client wants to hear them talk. The client couldn't care less. The client gave you a problem. They want to know how you can execute the solution. And you can't execute a solution if you honestly don't understand the problem. So ask questions. And James is saying the same thing about your Christian faith. If you don't understand the problem, you're going to have a tough time applying the wisdom that God gave you. The next thing that James is all about is, and this is where Martin Luther came into conflict with the book of James. And I've tried to read up on it, and I've always never really understood Martin Luther's issue. James talks about if you're a Christian, a product of your faith will be a series of actions that are exemplified in your life. I don't read James as you're trying to get to faith through your good works. I read James as my dad telling me, son, I really appreciate your listening and saying you're going to do it, but your lack of execution is really causing me great concern. He goes, your nodding and your acceptance of my wisdom is great, but I'd really like you to fulfill what I ask you to do. And, and that's all James is saying here. Your faith in Christ and the salvation associated with it leads to a series of actions. That's all he's saying. He's not in conflict with Paul. He wrote before Paul. So the concept that he's trying to supplement Paul and his writings in Romans and Galatians, it's kind of nonsensical. James wrote long before Paul did on those topics. All he's saying is, and once again, remember James is writing to a Jewish audience. This check the box theory of the Old Testament, doing your sacrifices, keeping the feast, all the things the Pharisees would have you do, that's not Christianity. Christianity is you understand the grace that has been given to you, and your life exemplifies that grace. So Go to James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. My brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, for man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is prevalent, and humbly accept the word that's been planted into you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom continues to do this, not forgetting what he heard, but is doing it. He will be blessed in what he does. So once again, I don't interpret anything that James is writing there to be your works will save you. I interpret it as, you know what Christianity is about. It's about service. It's about imitating Christ's life. Don't just sit there and show up to Sunday morning class, Sunday morning service, and check a box. Your life is supposed to be an exemplification of what you believe. Go do it. And there's a number of books that are written about the conflict between James and Paul. And once again, maybe I'm just like to oversimplify things, but I don't see any conflict at all. James is saying your faith has a requirement. That's it. Does anybody see it differently? Silence is yes. Is acceptance. Okay, next, James kind of continues that theme in chapter 4 and verse 17. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. So James makes it even more practical. So, we always view sin as an active thing, where we actually go out and sin. And we can acknowledge it. James puts a much heavier burden on us. If you know an opportunity has been presented to you to serve, and you take a pass for whatever reason, you sinned. And that one's the harder one. How many times during our day do we go through life and see people and opportunities that Christ has put in front of us and we miss? James sets a pretty high standard there. That's sin. And sometimes, we just don't even recognize it. And sometimes we don't recognize it until somebody actually says something to us. Jeff, I got to admit, you kind of hurt my feelings. You kind of left me cold with the following. It was like, and I'll be honest with you, when people bring it up, my only statement can be, I'm sorry, I missed it. And it's easy when you become caught up in the world and our own troubles for that to happen. And James' admonition to us is, understand the faith that you've been given. Be aware. Look around you. Understand that God is going to give you opportunities today to exemplify your Christian faith. Just look for it. It's coming. And when you miss, just pray about it. James was very clear. Ask for wisdom, you'll get it. And as my dad said one time, he goes, son, wisdom isn't going to hit you like it hit Solomon. It's going to hit you because of the things that you mess up. Just don't do it twice. He said, that's my one admonition to you. You're going to fail. Just don't fail the same way every day. It gets old. Dad was always the slap me in the head and tell me, great. This isn't about anything in particular, but you're going to need it before the day's over. I always used to laugh and go, thanks, Dad. And he would laugh and go on about his day. And we get to the end of the day, he goes, so, what was the slap for? And I'd just laugh and go, you don't want to know. So, moving on. James then spends a little bit of time with just kind of the practical side of, for lack of a better word, the Christian faith. But once again, remember who James is writing to. It's a bunch of Jews who have now become Christians in a world that they don't really understand. The Christian world that the Jews were given was not the Christian world they were expecting. And if you'll remember, there was it was actively written about, and James's believers were kind of critical to this. We went through it last week, but the believers of James are the ones that went to Antioch and caused the conflict about circumcision. Paul writes that he had to lecture Barnabas, Peter, and James's believers because when James's quote-unquote believers came, they separated themselves from Gentiles. So, they had a tough process that they were going through. And James, being a Jew's Jew, really struggled, or his believers did in particular, accepting the Gentiles. And I think for us, that's a little bit hard to understand. We don't live in a world where we're Jews first, where God's chosen people and we were told how this was going to work out. And it didn't work out anything like we were told. So, this first century Christian church, especially the Christians that came from Jerusalem, were struggling with the integration of the non-Jew. And they struggled with it all throughout the New Testament writings. And James and his believers in Jerusalem struggled the most. And they caused great conflict with the Gentile Christians. So James, as he continues to write, gets a little bit more, for lack of a better word, practical. If you go to James chapter 4, beginning of that verse. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desire that battles within you? You want something, but you don't get it. You kill and you covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask from the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get in your pleasures. And once again, this is a mindset issue with James. You don't live the life that Christ would have you to live, and then you're conflicted by when you pray, your prayers aren't successful. So one of the things that I always ask the teenagers about, and once again, each of them has a broader set of acquaintances I don't have. I said, who would you describe in your life as someone who is Christian? And I just let them answer. And I said, describe them to me. And you'll be amazed at how quickly your teenagers will focus on the people who are uplifting and are harmonious, is the best word I can come up with. They aren't constantly causing strife. And I think we miss that sometimes. They're not highly impressed with people who are constantly arguing, constantly negative, constantly, for lack of a better word, not looking out for others. So then I ask him, okay, so that's the Christian people. Now, who in your circle of contacts would you describe as wise? And then I always have to back up because the definition of wisdom is hard for teenagers. So you had to back up and read the scriptures on wisdom. And lo and behold, they're the same people. And for all of us, the bias is towards knowledge. If your knowledge is not used to build people up, James is asking, what are you doing? That's not the wisdom that we talk about in the scriptures. If you use your wisdom to undermine, to quarrel, to argue, to sift the chaff from the wheat, you're not applying it correctly. And James spends a good bit of time as you go through that book and makes that patently clear to everyone. The Pharisees were the example that they all understood and they all despised. The Pharisees knew everything. They just didn't know Christianity. They didn't know what it meant to be a Christian. They really didn't know what it meant to be a good Jew, but now we've moved beyond that. And they struggled with every one of the Christian leaders that came after. The Pharisees never, ever understood the concept of Christianity. And if you go to Josephus, they ultimately killed James. The Pharisees were the ones who tossed him from the pinnacle of the temple. And when James refused to die, they stoned him. And James, I don't know if he knew his fate, but he knew what this verse was talking about. And you have to imagine when James wrote this, he said, I'm writing to the Pharisees. You have now taken God's word, the Jewish law, and made it unbearable. And now you're trying to do the same thing with Christianity. You're trying to take this yoke and apply it to as we talked about 2 weeks ago, to the Gentiles. And he jokingly says, we good Jews couldn't follow the law. And now you want to make the Gentiles fail? So James is basically, as I said, it's one of the most practical books in the Bible because it's easy to apply. It doesn't matter if we're in the first century church or the current day church. James is a book of application. So if you go to James 4:10. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. So James, in all of this, is trying to give you attributes that he thinks, if you can display as a Christian, will make you a successful Christian. And humility is the one that kind of weaves its way around through James, but he just explicitly states it in 4:10. So I've always been curious as to everyone's definition of humility. Because when you describe someone who's humble, sometimes when you listen to the definition, it's somebody who doesn't say anything. And nothing could be further from the truth. But the humble person, so let me back up. Just someone raise your hand and describe humility for me. Andy, thanks for raising your hand. Other thoughts? Selfishness? Yes, sir. Sue? Yeah, so if you'll notice there, it's not passive. It just takes you and moves you behind. You're not the focus, but it's extremely active. And James is saying, I want your humility to show through because of the Spirit and the fruits that you're producing. And James never moves off of the concept that the central theme to Christianity is service. People who serve have generally understood that they're not the focus, that the people they're serving are the focus. And as you heard from all the comments about humility, those are the people, when you ask, identify someone who's impacted your life who you would consider humble. And they always come back to the same thing. It's people who took the time to listen and then do something. The concept of active listening is immensely important for a Christian. You have to listen, and then you have to understand. Sometimes it's just saying a prayer with them. Sometimes it's just mentioning that they're going to be in your prayers. Sometimes it's actually getting other people involved, but letting them know that you care. And that's what James's whole book is about. One writer summarized, he said, James basically writes a series of proverbs that says, to be a Christian, you have to serve and you have to care. That pretty well ends our study. Thanks, everybody. Like I said, I will send out what our topic is going to be next week. Thank you.